J. Edgar Hoover and FBI officials had been focused on the University of California, and particularly the Berkeley campus, for many years. They first focused on it during World War II. They discovered that Soviet agents were attempting to steal secrets from the nuclear laboratories where Robert Oppenheimer was overseeing the nation's effort to develop the nuclear weapons that were dropped on Japan. The FBI had a wiretap in a local Communist Party office in Oakland and overheard a conversation, this was in 1942, in which they were discussing trying to get secrets from the lab through a Communist Party member who worked under Oppenheimer. This led to a massive FBI investigation into Soviet espionage at the nuclear labs, and eventually led to some arrests. In 1949, professors led by Edward Tolman refused to sign a mandatory loyalty oath on the principle that professors should not be singled out for an additional loyalty oath. They had already signed the loyalty oath that all state officials signed, and they resented being targeted as a suspect group. They also feared that this would chill First Amendment activity. It would chill the kind of free-ranging discussion that's necessary for a campus community involved in pursuing the truth.
What happened was that I got jobs, I got offered, I got wined and dined in the typical academic manner. And then when it came time to go to the job, the equivalents of our board of regents in these universities turned me down based on loyalty oaths, which later were called unconstitutional. And of course, there was a big fight on loyalty oaths in California, which resulted in a lot of people being fired and later reinstated. And the oath itself was sharply modified after the Supreme Court threw out the worst aspects of the loyalty oaths nationally. When I was due to get my job, when I was due to come to the University of California at San Diego, there was this oath, which was that you don't want to overthrow the government of the state of California by force and violence, something to that effect. And I guess I signed that, which I guess everybody who's an employee does. And so anyway, I got to the university. But before I got my appointment, sure enough, the same problem came up in California, and the Regents delayed the appointment. I would have been here in June of '64, but I got here in August because the Regents were concerned. And actually, I got here and was accepted and got a position as associate professor only because professors on this campus and also in San Diego intervened very strongly with the Board of Regents in defense of my academic freedom. So I'm beholden to them.
Hoover's concern about Berkeley continued to grow in 1960 when there was a protest at San Francisco City Hall against the House Un-American Activities Committee. A number of students from Berkeley and colleges in the Bay Area went to San Francisco City Hall with the intention of sitting in the audience at this hearing and seeing what was going on. They were especially interested because one Berkeley student had been subpoenaed to appear to testify about his political activities. The students were surprised to find that they were excluded from this hearing, and they began to chant, "Let us in, let us in." And this led to a confrontation in which San Francisco police came with fire hoses and washed them down the steps. And this made headlines across the country, including a full-page photograph that covered the whole front page of the San Francisco Chronicle. Hoover read about this protest and he blamed Clark Kerr again for not disciplining students and allowing them to engage in this kind of activity. So Hoover grew increasingly concerned in 1959 when there was an optional essay question on the English entrance exam for entering high school seniors. The question asked, what are the dangers to a democracy of a national police organization like the FBI, which operates secretly and is unresponsive to public criticism? When Hoover heard about this question, he was absolutely livid, and he ordered agents in California to investigate who wrote this question and who allowed it to be printed and distributed to students. But even before that, he ordered what was essentially a covert public relations campaign, whereby agents contacted their allies in law enforcement and politics and church groups and asked them to write the university regents protesting this question. One agent actually met with the governor on Hoover's behalf and complained about it. And this campaign was successful. It forced the university to withdraw the question and to publicly apologize to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. So when the free speech movement happened in 1964, Hoover was especially concerned. First there was the essay question, then there was the protest at City Hall, and now the students had captured a police car and held it captive for 32 hours on Sproul Plaza. Hoover blamed Clark Kerr for not being a tough enough disciplinarian.
I was very attracted to Berkeley because in 1961, I think it was, or 60, the House Un-American Activities Committee came to San Francisco, and a lot of the Berkeley students were protesting that, and I saw Berkeley as a sort of center for radical political student movement, which I was very interested in.
I think I've been underestimating the political awareness of the faculty. The faculty were very incensed at the Katz case, not because they had Katz's politics, but because it was a case of the academic procedures of the university being violated by the Regents. And so that helped set the stage for a favorable vote in December, but even though it was technically a different issue.
What we see in the files in the years following that is that the FBI veered away from this very important national security mission and came to focus on students and professors and administrators who were involved in completely lawful First Amendment activity. And they became the subject of intensive FBI investigation simply because FBI officials deemed their activities subversive. I started studying journalism and writing for the Daily Californian, and I knew, of course, Berkeley's history as the scene of the free speech movement, and I knew also that Congress had held hearings and found that the FBI had engaged in unlawful surveillance of political activity elsewhere. So I was very curious to know what had the FBI been up to at Berkeley, which was the center of so many important protests, particularly in the free speech movement. Well, the Daily Cal had gotten some FBI files under the Freedom of Information Act, and the editor asked me to study those files and write some stories about them. So I did that. And those stories ran in 1982. But in the process, I realized there was much more to the story. So even before I had finished writing those stories, I submitted a greatly expanded Freedom of Information Act, actually a series of them, in 1981, and began a very long process of what ultimately turned into a 27-year legal battle to get the FBI files concerning Berkeley. I was very fortunate to have the support of a number of pro bono attorneys who, over the years, brought 5 lawsuits on my behalf. And ultimately, these lawsuits forced the FBI to release more than 300,000 pages of documents concerning the entire University of California system and also the greater campus community, including many different individuals and organizations who were involved in activities here during the Cold War period, especially during the 60s. And I knew the FBI had been involved in political surveillance, but I was very surprised to find that the extent to which the FBI had infiltrated the campus community, not only student organizations, but also professors, administrators, and even the Board of Regents. And not only that, but the FBI had gone beyond simply gathering information to using that information to influence, in an effort to influence events at Berkeley and to manipulate public opinion about events at the university. Some of which involved COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, an unlawful operation to, in the words of the Bureau, to disrupt and neutralize people who were engaged in activities that J. Edgar Hoover believed were un-American in some way. I don't know the full extent of it because the FBI redacted many of the records, but the documents do make clear that one of the administration informants, or I should say informers for the FBI, an informer being somebody who is not paid, but provides information to the FBI in a secret fashion. One of the informers was Alex Sheriffs, who was a psychology professor and a vice chancellor in charge of student affairs. And he was very close to Clark Kerr at various points, especially during the years when Clark Kerr was chancellor of Berkeley from 1952 to 1958. When Clark Kerr became president of the university in 1958, he did not take Alex Sheriffs with him to the president's staff. And Alex Sheriffs was very disappointed about this. And he became embittered towards Clark Kerr. At the same time, Alex Sheriffs, who had been initially chosen by Kerr to be his liaison to student groups in the 50s, because Sheriffs had great rapport with members of the fraternities and sororities. But as the times changed in the late 50s and the early 60s, a small but growing number of students were involved in political activity on campus, lawful political activity. I'm thinking particularly of the organization known as Slate. Sheriffs was very unhappy about that. He viewed Slate's activities as too critical of the university, too critical of government policy, and he began to suspect that somehow Slate was being manipulated by the Communist Party or other subversive organizations. One day in 1961, Sheriffs contacted the FBI and invited agents to come to his office for a secret meeting. And at this meeting, Sheriffs told the FBI agents, one of whom was an agent named Donald Jones. And Donald Jones was the FBI's lead agent for investigations on the UC Berkeley campus. And Sheriffs told Jones and his fellow agent that he suspected that Slate was up to no good. And he suggested that the FBI keep an eye on them. And he Sheriffs described Slate as consisting of malcontents, misfits, and other political activists. And Slate was not doing anything unlawful or illegal. It's just that Sheriffs didn't like the positions they were taking and the fact that they were criticizing the establishment. So at this meeting, Sheriffs agreed to continue to provide the FBI with information about Slate or other campus activities, and also agreed to keep his relationship with the FBI secret. As the years went on and student activism continued to grow through the early 60s, and then when it really erupted with the free speech movement in 1964, sheriffs became increasingly agitated about student activism, and he increasingly blamed Clark Kerr for allowing that to happen. It was sheriffs who had imposed the crackdown on the free speech activities at Bancroft and Telegraph Avenue, where people were setting up card tables and handing out flyers for all kinds of organizations, whether conservative or liberal or socialist. Sheriffs ordered students to stop doing that in June of 1964. At the time, Clark Kerr was not even in the United States. He was in the Far East, traveling in his capacity as president of the University of California. Hoover blamed Clark Kerr for not being a tough enough disciplinarian. So he ordered his agents to investigate the free speech movement. And in fact, agents were already on campus the very day that the police car was captured. As a matter of routine, FBI agents and other law enforcement officials were often present on campus, monitoring activities on Sproul Plaza, taking notes and photographs. And the day that the police car was captured, several of them were actually in the crowd. And they took photographs and they wrote up reports and they sent that back to Hoover. Hoover ordered a further investigation. And that investigation soon expanded not only from investigating which students were involved and what were their political backgrounds, but also who were their parents and what were their political backgrounds, who were the professors who supported them and what was their political background, and right up to the Board of Regents, where several regents were supporters of the free speech movement.
I don't know what role the FBI spied. All I knew is that we had them. We didn't pay much attention to them. Our meetings were open to the general public. We did nothing in secret. In general, we relied upon Robert's Rules of Order, which is bizarre even to mention now in this modern time. I doubt that even many people know what they are. It's how you run a parliamentary system there. Edgar Hoover's reputation ruining smear campaigns meant nothing to us. We had no jobs to lose. We had no reputations to be smeared. We were immune to his threats. It was obvious that things that were said in the meetings were ending up in the newspapers and were also ending up in some police reports. Any effort to hide things would have been counterproductive. Edgar Hoover's immense power came from everyone in power knowing that he had dirt on them. And therefore they were afraid of him. And if you had something, a skeleton in your closet, which of course everyone did, he knew it, and he would threaten you with that information. And so upon his death, it was basically all destroyed. We didn't know specifically. We had suspicions. People who were just a little too clean cut or who were a little bit too vociferous. There was always the one who was edging us on to even more radical activity, even more outrageous behavior. And we always spotted him as the plant. But we knew that one of his jobs was also to divert attention from the real spy, whom he did not necessarily know, in fact, generally did not know who that was. So we had the fake spy who we were supposed to spot, and the real spy whom we were not supposed to spot. And in fact, later on, we were very surprised to find out certain people actually were spies. We thought, I wouldn't have suspected that fellow, but there it was.
Hoover's investigation went beyond just collecting information to trying to disrupt the free speech movement by leaking information to friendly newspaper editors who would write articles critical of the free speech movement. Hoover's intention was to influence public opinion away from the free speech movement and to bring more pressure on the university administration to crack down on student protests. He was trying to influence university policy through these secret operations. And one of the ways that Hoover collected information about the university was through Alex Sheriffs, who was a vice chancellor for student affairs and had become an FBI informant, and also through other professors and administrators who were upset by the free speech movement and were angry at Clark Kerr. And they included a professor named Hardin Jones. Hardin Jones was an assistant director of the Donner Radiation Laboratory, one of the nation's, I think it actually was the nation's first laboratory dedicated to studying nuclear medicine. And Hardin Jones, who in 1964 was 51 years old, was very upset to see this police car captured on Sproul Plaza and was furious when the protests continued. And he wrote letters to Clark Kerr urging him to take strong action against the students. And when Kerr refused to go along with this very severe action that was being pushed by Alex Sheriffs and Hardin Jones and others, Hardin Jones began to supply information to the FBI.
The chairman of my department and one of his cohorts were out in Sproul Hall Plaza recording and taking photographs of the people as they spoke from the Sproul Hall steps.
The more the protests went on, the more upset Hardin Jones became, the more inflammatory his reports to the FBI became. And it got to the point where his reports were so full of conspiracies that even FBI officials concluded that he was greatly exaggerating things and was not a reliable source. But they continued to accept his information and use it when it suited their purposes. Alexander Grandin was a colleague of Hardin Jones at the Donner Radiation Laboratory, and he worked with Hardin Jones in collecting information about student protesters and in providing it to Hardin Jones, who then passed it to the FBI. During this period, the FBI also developed a source in the Board of Regents, a man named Edwin Pauley, who was the senior regent, very conservative in his political outlook, very wealthy, and made many millions of dollars through the oil industry. His company was called Pauley Petroleum, and he had been very generous to the university. Pauley Pavilion at UCLA is named for him, and Pauley Ballroom at Berkeley also. And Pauley was very upset with the student protests and especially the free speech movement. And he was very angry at Clark Kerr for not making the students stop, for not disciplining them or expelling Mario Savio and others. In early 1965, after the free speech movement had successfully convinced the regents to rescind the ban on political activity on campus as unconstitutional, J. Edgar Hoover met secretly with Alex McCone, who was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency and had graduated from Berkeley in the early 1920s. And at this meeting, which took place in early 1965, Hoover and McCone agreed that they would secretly give information to Edwin Pauley on the Board of Regents, information about the student protesters and their background, as well as information about supporters of the free speech movement, including liberal members of the Regents. And that Edwin Pauley would then use this information without revealing that he had it, but he would use it to try to influence other members of the Board of Regents to vote to fire Clark Kerr. And throughout 1965, there's a series of FBI memos describing how an FBI agent met with Pauley and would give him various reports And then Pauly would report back some weeks later about his progress in mustering the votes to fire Clark Kerr. And this went on throughout 1965. But finally, in October of 65, Pauly reported that he had concluded that so long as Pat Brown was governor, Clark Kerr would remain president of the University of California, because Brown was a strong supporter of Clark Kerr. So the FBI's efforts to leak this information, leak confidential FBI information to Edwin Pauly to get Clark Kerr fired, ultimately failed.
Clark Kerr was a very staunch liberal and played a very major role in the expansion of education in California, and everybody knew that before I got here.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it sort of came a cropper during some of the struggles over loyalty oaths and ultimately over the free speech movement. But the paradox, if you want to call it that, as you know from some of the material that's come out since, is that when the free speech movement developed, it turns out that Governor Reagan and J. Edgar Hoover had colluded to get rid of Clark Kerr. So there was an interesting situation in which the students regarded Clark Kerr as a major enemy of free speech because of the fact that he represented authority in that period. And on the other hand, he was regarded as the biggest enemy of the FBI, who had no place in the university. Life gets very complicated, as you can tell looking around at what's happening in the world today.
J. Edgar Hoover had approved a series of leaks of confidential FBI information to Edwin Pauly, with the intention that Pauly could use that information to convince other regents to vote to fire Clark Kerr without revealing that he actually had FBI information. But over the summer of 1965, Pauly's efforts came to naught. And FBI officials realized that as long as Governor Pat Brown was in office, that Clark Kerr would remain as president of the University of California. So when Ronald Reagan announced that he would be running for governor of California, J. Edgar Hoover and other FBI officials saw that as a breath of fresh air. They thought, if Reagan wins, we'll finally have an ally in Sacramento who can help us to clean up all this protest at Berkeley. It turns out that Ronald Reagan had a long secret history with the FBI that goes back to the 1940s in Hollywood, when he was an actor and an official with the Screen Actors Guild. And at that time, the FBI was investigating communist influence in the motion picture industry. A massive investigation, codenamed ComPic. And one night in 1946, FBI officials knocked on Ronald Reagan's door in Hollywood. And as Reagan recalled in his memoir, he invited them in and offered them coffee. And they proceeded to tell him that they knew that he was involved in some liberal organizations, but he might be surprised to know that some of some of the other people in those organizations were subversives in some way. And not only that, but they were saying bad things about Ronald Reagan behind his back. As Reagan wrote in his memoir, I must admit, they opened my eyes to a good many things. The agents asked if they could stay in touch with Reagan, and he said, okay, sure. Reagan doesn't say much more about that in his memoir, but the FBI files show that in the following years, he developed what the FBI called a close and cordial relationship with Bureau officials, and that he became an FBI informer. Now, in the 1980s, the San Jose Mercury News, under the Freedom of Information Act, obtained some records showing that Reagan had been an informer in Hollywood during the 40s. But those records were very limited, and they were heavily redacted. In the course of my research, I brought one lawsuit that sought to get additional Reagan records, and the court ordered more records released, and they show that Reagan was much more involved as an FBI informer, was much more aggressive, that he named many more actors and actresses as potentially subversive, and that while he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, FBI officials had wide access to guild records on actors and actresses without their knowledge. So Reagan became a very good source for the FBI in Hollywood during the 40s and 50s. And later, when Reagan ran for governor, J. Edgar Hoover looked on that favorably and sought to give Reagan personal and political help. Reagan was very aggressive during his campaign in critiquing or criticizing the protests at Berkeley and in criticizing Clark Kerr. And there's one speech he gave in May of 1966, in the middle of the campaign year, at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. It was the largest rally of Reagan's campaign so far. And during a lengthy speech, he focused in good measure on the university and said at one point, there is a leadership gap and a morality and decency gap in Sacramento. And there is no better illustration of that than what has been perpetrated at the University of California at Berkeley, where a small minority of beatniks, radicals, and filthy speech advocates have brought such shame to a great university. So Reagan was very effective in using the protests at Berkeley as a way to attack his opponent, Governor Brown, Pat Brown. And his rhetoric became increasingly harsh. At one point, he claimed that because of the free speech movement, applications to university had fallen off. And then when the university said, no, actually, applications are up, Reagan said, well, if that's the case, it's only because you've lowered the standards. And that was also false. And Reagan's rhetoric became so harsh, and that one of the regents, H.R. Haldeman, who later became infamous as President Nixon's, one of President Nixon's main aides, and who was actually convicted during the Watergate scandal. Well, Haldeman was a member of the Regents, and Reagan's rhetoric became so harsh that Haldeman became concerned that it would actually damage the institution, and he suggested to the Reagan campaign that he tone it down. the capture of the police car and the free speech movement and the anti-war protests that followed, particularly those led by the Vietnam Day Committee here in Berkeley, were very shocking to many members of the public who were much more accustomed to campus complacency and orderliness of the 1950s. Many voters were upset that they would turn on their television and see on the nightly news what seemed like continuous protests at Berkeley. And it came to symbolize more than just the protests. It came to symbolize this great upheaval in society, the generational conflict, the conflict over the war in Vietnam, conflict over race relations. So when Reagan campaigned and talked about the mess at Berkeley, and by the way, I don't think he ever used the phrase mess at Berkeley. I know it's often described that way, but I've never found an actual quote where he used that phrase. But he certainly talked about the problems at Berkeley. And by focusing on that, he was able to tap into widespread voter concern and anger over all these changes that were disrupting the way things had been. And Reagan also campaigned on other issues, on anti-taxes, anti-big government. But Lou Cannon, who was Reagan's primary biographer, wrote in his account of events that the protests at Berkeley became the single hottest issue in Reagan's campaign, the most emotional one. And as Reagan later said in an oral history for the Bancroft Library, as he began to campaign early on in 1965, wherever he went around the state, people would ask him, "What's your opinion about the free speech movement? What would you do about those protests in Berkeley?" And Reagan, who himself did not like the protests, quickly warmed to the subject, and it became, as Lou Cannon said, the hottest issue in the campaign. Reagan won by a landslide in November 1966, more than a 1 million vote margin, and was inaugurated in January of 1967. One of his first acts in office was to secretly phone the FBI office in San Francisco and request a confidential briefing about events at Berkeley. The head of the FBI office in San Francisco sent a memo back to J. Edgar Hoover reporting Reagan's request and recommending against granting this briefing because it was such a politically sensitive subject, and if it ever became public, it would be very embarrassing to the FBI, which after all is supposed to be a nonpartisan law enforcement agency. But Hoover ordered the agent to go ahead and comply with Reagan's request, writing in a memo that this presents an opportunity. Several days later, Reagan attended his first meeting of the Board of Regents. And with his election, the balance of power on the Board of Regents had shifted because he not only became an ex officio member himself, but he was able to appoint 2 other members. So at this meeting, the Regents voted to fire Clark Kerr. And there's an FBI memo that was released in one of my lawsuits in which agents interviewed another regent about what had happened. And this regent said he understood that Reagan had received some information from the FBI concerning events at Berkeley. And this suggested that Reagan had used the information from his secret briefing at the governor's mansion to persuade people to vote to fire Clark Kerr. Although Reagan later told reporters that he played no particular role in convincing people to fire Clark Kerr, that everybody just voted their conscience. Clark Kerr famously said after this, "I was fired as I was hired, with great enthusiasm."